Here we go, 2 days in Great Basin National Park. From alpine lakes to beautiful snow-capped peaks and some amazing fall colors, Great Basin is a hidden gem among national parks. I had a couple of events in Las Vegas around mid-October, so in between them I went to Great Basin National Park. I flew into Vegas on October 10th, and this is when I had my first of the two events at the Bellagio. I finished with this event around 10 p.m. I went and got some sleep and then headed out early the next morning. I think I got up around 5 a.m. before the sun had risen to head to Great Basin. As I drove, the sun slowly rose above the horizon. It was a bit of a cloudy day, but it made for some beautiful and interesting views on the drive there. From Vegas, it was about 4.5 hours, but because of the beautiful natural scenery, it wasn't all that bad. I arrived at the visitor center and there were no cars there, not a good sign. This was October 11th and it was during the government shutdown, so the visitor center was closed, as well as any tours to the Lehman Caves of Great Basin. I did not stay here for long. I headed to my Airbnb, which was right on the edge of Great Basin. I got checked in there. It was a nice little cabin, had a kitchen and a stovetop and a comfy bed, so it was a fine place to stay during my 2 days in Great Basin. The little town right on the edge of Great Basin is called Baker. My little cabin was right across from the main gas station in Baker. I was on my way to go on a hike when I saw a sign for a farmer's market and I had to stop. It was just a very small farmer's market under a shaded canopy. I purchased a couple apples and some dried herbs and a few candles. Happy to support the local community in a very small way. After this, I immediately headed to hike the Alpine Lakes Trail. Here is the trail on all trails that I planned on hiking, but it did not go exactly to plan. About halfway there, the road was closed and a park ranger was out there giving information. This closure had nothing to do with the government shutdown. It was due to weather because it was supposed to snow that night. But the park ranger did let me know that there was a trail from the campground to the Alpine Lakes Trail. It would just be an extra 3 miles each way. So even though it wasn't ideal, I chose to do that. So I walked through the campground. Immediately, the beautiful fall colors quelled any irritation I had about the extra 6 miles total I was going to have to hike. And as I approached the trailhead, the stunning quaking aspens came into view. These trees were all over the place in Great Basin, and I knew that there may be some fall colors there around this time, but I did not expect the stunning vibrance of these trees all around the park. As I hiked along, it was easy to see how these quaking aspens got their name. Their leaves shimmered and almost seemed to sparkle in the wind. Some of them were light bright yellow, and some were a darker burnt orange color. It seemed like maybe the taller trees that were closer to the sun had the darker colored leaves. At certain points, these quaking aspens had such stark contrast with the rest of the landscape, which seemed almost barren besides the evergreen trees. As I climbed upward, the trail eventually opened up into a field that exposed part of the mountainous landscape that I had gotten great views of on my drive here. This trail would lead from the Upper Lehman campground to the Wheeler Peak campground, which is the campground that I am approaching here. This would have been a beautiful place to camp if I had my car with me, but I flew in from Nashville, so I had to get an Airbnb for this one. I walked through the Wheeler Peak campground and eventually made it to the Bristlecone Alpine Lakes Trail. I originally planned to do that longer hike, which was 6 miles that I showed you on all trails, but because I had already hiked 3 miles and would have to hike that same 3 miles back, I just did a shorter loop, which was around 2.5 miles. And that took me to 2 alpine lakes. This trail was at a bit higher elevation, so at this point the fall colors had really disappeared. It was too cold for them up here, and the ominous clouds hanging overhead and floating over the mountains created a very ominous setting for the hike. As I walked along, eventually the trail leveled out, and I was just walking closer and closer to the base of some of the mountains in front of me. And in doing this, one of the alpine lakes slowly came into view. The first one I came to was was the larger of the two. It was called Stella Lake. And the majority of the water in these alpine lakes comes mostly from snowmelt. As the landscape opened up to expose this alpine lake, it also exposed the area to more wind because there were not as many trees around to block it. So up here it got pretty cold. I hardly even needed a jacket when I was down at the Upper Lehman campground, but up here I needed a jacket and gloves and a hat. Despite the ominous cloudy weather, Stella Lake still had a beautiful shimmer to it, and although I wondered what this area would look like on a beautiful sunny day, I appreciated the creepy, gloomy atmosphere that the impending weather created. I did not stay here for too long because the wind was battering me pretty hard, so I continued the hike through the bristlecone pines to Teresa Lake, which was the smaller of the two lakes, and it was actually substantially smaller. I assumed that the lake would grow bigger at different times of year. It would probably be at its largest during the spring when all of the snow is melting, but at this point it was not huge and it seemed relatively shallow, but nonetheless it was still very beautiful. I approached it from one side and really only had some trees in the background, so I went around to the other side and got a much better view of the lake with the mountains in the background. Even during the hour or so that I spent in this area, it seemed like slowly the clouds were becoming thicker and thicker and clinging more onto the peaks of the mountains. This view here gave a great perspective of the size of the lake in comparison to the surroundings and to the mountains behind it. Once I wrapped up here, I headed back through the campground and down the same trail that I had come up on. The trail was all uphill on the way there, so on the way back down to my car, it was all downhill. And of course it was the same views as I had seen on my way up, but it was nice to see them from a different perspective, and the fall colors were so beautiful that I didn't mind seeing them twice. But eventually I made it back to my car. On the ride back to my Airbnb, I saw a double rainbow forming amidst the clouds in the distance. I also stopped at the Bristlecone General Store to grab a couple snacks before settling in at my Airbnb. It rained all night, but the next day was nothing but clear skies. I planned on doing the Wheeler Peak Trail, so I hoped that the road was no longer closed, but unfortunately it was. The Wheeler Peak Trail is an 8-mile trail, and it could be reached via the trail I took the day before from the Lehman campground to the Wheeler Peak campground. It would be around 13 miles in total. But at this point, I decided to do it. When I pulled into the parking lot, I was about to film a magic trick, but someone walked up beside me and I decided to show him one instead. He chose a card. I forgot to get him to show it to the camera, but it was the 8 of diamonds. He placed it back in the deck, and then I mixed the cards face up into face down. Kind of a weird way to shuffle, but I handed him the cards to hold and took a picture of them. Of course, you can see they are all face up and face down here as I zoom in, face up and face down on that side, and face up and face down on the other side. Seems like an obvious thing, but when he looked at the picture, they were not face up and face down, and this was on his phone. All of them were facing the same way, except his card, the 8 of diamonds.
To the camera.
That's my card.
He was a fun guy, and he followed me on Instagram. But very soon after this, I got started on the same trail as the day prior. Here I show my phone just to show it's October 12th, 8:48 a.m. And you can already see the ice and snow on the ground as I was hiking, and I did not bring my spikes with me. At a certain point, after I had slipped a few times, I realized that I could not go as fast as I needed to on this trail because I needed to be back in Vegas this evening because I had a gig the next day there. I was only a couple miles in and it was already very icy, so I could only imagine how it was closer to the top, and I made the decision to go back to my car and find a different hike, which ended up being very beautiful as well. So I got back in my car and drove about 40 or 45 minutes to a different part of the park, to the Serviceberry Trailhead. Eventually I turned from the main paved road onto, I believe, Snake Creek Road, which was a gravel road, and it was in relatively good condition. I was in a generic rental car and I was able to drive on it just fine, although I did have to slow down in certain areas. The drive itself was very beautiful, and I was driving in between craggy peaks and amongst the beautiful fall foliage. I honestly couldn't get enough of the stunning colors, and eventually I made it to the Serviceberry Trailhead to do a 3.2 mile loop trail with 657 feet of elevation gain. Although I was quite disappointed that I could not do the Wheeler Peak Trail, the Serviceberry Trail soon made up for it. I started the loop by going counterclockwise, and there were some nice views on this first part of the trail, but the most beautiful views came from the second half of the trail. The trail led through a patch of, I believe, Utah junipers. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is, I believe, the most common species of tree in Great Basin. Soon enough, the landscape opened up as I walked in between the mountains that surrounded me. Up ahead, you can see a forest of quaking aspens that have all seemed to lost their leaves at this point, but as I walked through them, there seemed to be small patches that were still vibrant yellow. I bet 2 weeks earlier, these trees would have all been stunning golden yellow. But even the ones that had lost their leaves seemed to take on this ghostly white appearance, which contrasted so greatly with the trees around them that still had their beautiful yellow golden leaves. To my surprise, I found out that quaking aspens are the most widely distributed tree species in North America, and they can be found as far north as Alaska and Canada and as far south as Mexico. Not to mention, a grove of quaking aspens in Utah is regarded as the largest known living thing on Earth, with nearly 50,000 stems protruding from a single root system and covering more than 100 acres. Anyway, as the hike continued, the views would open up at certain points and reveal the landscape far into the distance. And as I looped around, I went back through a different part of that Utah juniper forest, which contrasted so nicely with other parts of the trail. Eventually, the snow-capped peaks revealed themselves above the trees far into the distance. And when I first saw them, it kind of reminded me in a small way of the Rockies. Just the way you have all of these exposed peaks covered with snow. Obviously not to the scale of the Rockies, but still just so beautiful to walk amongst. And there were these patches of quaking aspens peppered throughout the forest that led up to these mountain peaks. Great Basin is one of the smaller national parks. It's only 77,000 acres compared to many others, which are millions. But I actually liked this. It means that the park was more condensed and easier to explore. You can drive from one side of the park to the other to do the trails without being in the car for hours. For example, if you're in the Smokies, you can spend 3 or 4 hours driving from one side of the park to another side. As I continued along the trail, I slowly meandered down switchbacks, and every time I was exposed to a new view of the surrounding mountains. On the drive here, there also seemed to be some nice camping in this area. I saw quite a few off-road camper vehicles traveling down the road, and I assumed that if the other campgrounds were all filled up, this could be a very nice place to stay, and definitely more isolated and nestled in amongst the mountains. I continued making my way down the trail, and as I did this, the beautiful yellow patches came more and more into view, and they contrasted so beautifully with the greens of the evergreen trees and shrubs, as well as the snow-capped peaks. This was the most beautiful part of the hike. I even saw a small turkey enjoying the sun and fall colors as well. This was the third national park in our attempt to do all 63 within a year, and it was also the third one that I had seen a turkey in. I took some time right here at the end of the trail to get some nice shots of these beautiful trees with the mountains in the background. I will mention one other popular thing in the park is the Layman Caves, which are only accessible via tours by the national park, and these tours were not in operation at this point because of the government shutdown. But if you visit, it might be something that you would want to look into. Anyway, I made it back to the car and headed right back down the same road that I drove in on. It was almost 1 p.m. and I headed back to Vegas to do my gig. My gig the next night was at Resorts World. Here's a quick clip of me performing for some guests. I hope you enjoyed the video. The next 2 parks will be Indiana Dunes and Cuyahoga Valley, and they will be part of the same video. So stay tuned. Bye.
What?